Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long. And with that, Ty, and I don't use this word, lightly, Virginia Tech media legend, icon, Andy. You see that? Andy Bitter. This is I don't know what we have in terms of copyright, but that's at least like an 8-bit alt version. Andy, how's it going today?
It's great. I feel like I'm on the old Nintendo system.
That's
That's great.
8-bit Metallica, allegedly, is, it's a feel-good moment heading into what is hopefully, Ty, pro transition here, a feel-good or a feel-better year for the Hokies. How's it going today?
Me, it's going pretty well.
Yeah. See, I don't care about Ty. I
didn't know if you were talking to him, your partner, or to me.
No.
I'm doing well.
Okay.
Spring practice almost done here.
Yes.
I think all Virginia Tech fans are just kind of eager to put the last season away, to get that taste out of their mouth. And they got a bunch of new transfers this year, a lot of new players, and I think they're very excited about what they have. We'll see if excitement translates into many more than 3 wins they had last year, but certainly a better feeling, I think, than a couple months ago. So
let's talk about that feeling. Let's go to the negative. Let's go to the down, at least before we go to the hopefully optimistic. Let's ask a simple question. What exactly happened? What is the proper context of a 3-win 2022 that would help us to understand why things went so, I suppose terribly would be an appropriate term in Brent Pry's first year in Blacksburg?
Well, they didn't have a lot of talent. They didn't really make the most of the talent they had, and they had a historically bad offense. If that sums it up, it was pretty ugly. I thought there was going to be, it was sort of a turning point in the roster construction as it was. Even if they had retained Justin Fuente,
right,
it was going to be rough because there were a lot of seniors that left that team. A lot of guys hit the transfer portal as well, and not like run of the mill guys, like guys that they had been depending on. Guys like Trey Turner, Brock Hoffman, these sort of guys that have been around for a couple of years. So I think it was going to be sort of a talent deficiency to begin with. Add on top of that, a coaching transition to a first-time head coach who I think admittedly made a bunch of mistakes in his first year in terms of how he structured stuff and how he would have done stuff. I think that's just sort of the learning curve for somebody like that who's worn the big whistle for the first time. And then the offense was just plain bad. And there was no two ways about that. They did not have a lot of talent, especially on offense. They had maybe one receiver who consistently could get open. Their best running back, Malachi Thomas, got hurt in the preseason, hurt in midseason, played about 3 games. Their offensive line couldn't push anybody around. And, the quarterback was just mediocre. Grant Wells,
right.
I think he had 9 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, and you're not going to win a lot of games like that. So there were just a lot of questions on that side. Whatever they did defensively, it wasn't enough to make up for the offensive shortcomings, which has been, a tried and tested story at Virginia Tech for a long time here. So just a rough first season all around, and we'll see if it gets any better this year.
You mentioned the mistakes from Brent Pry that he can control. He can control a certain amount. Obviously, talent is something that takes time to rebuild a roster and sort of build that roster in exactly your image. So what was it that went wrong that Brent Pry could have controlled better? You mentioned the term learning curve, and where are we now with his learning curve?
Well, I think you see this with a lot of head coaches that are coordinators, and they're reluctant to give up the play calling duties that they have. And he was going to do that come hell or high water his first year. He was going to call defensive plays, shape the defense the way he wanted to. And, I don't necessarily think he regrets it necessarily because he wanted to teach that defense in a certain way and set the foundation for it, but probably should have given it up a little bit earlier than he did. He finally turned it over to Chris Marv, defensive coordinator in the Liberty game. They played very well in the Liberty game. It allowed Pry to sort of free up and focus his attention more on the team stuff and the offense. And I think that showed in that game. Offensively, I think they were a little stubborn with what they tried to do. They tried to be a smash mouth team. They didn't have the personnel to do it. They just didn't have the talent or the bodies to do that up front and in the running backs. And they really made that change too late in the season, or tried to adjust stuff too late in the season, or didn't see that coming in the preseason. And I think, defensively, Pry has his scheme and the way he wants to do things. I don't think there was a total understanding of his personnel at times. And, they're building the plane in the air as they're going.
Right.
I mean, they're trying to figure things out and see capabilities of guys. But you see late in the season, it's like you've got a linebacker covering a slot receiver across the field and giving up big plays. Like they're just not fast enough to run with these guys. They might have been at Penn State, and they might be once you get this thing humming here with some recruits that are recruited to your system, but that's not the personnel that they had last year. And I think at times he was slow to recognize that, and that cost them in some big spots.
Almost every head coach, new head coach, without exception, when you are behind the scenes, when you're sitting in their office, will tell you something like, look, the roster that I inherited when I got here, this is something that's going to take a lot of time. Almost without exception, that's what you'll hear. Where was that roster? You mentioned the transfers, and Justin Fuente got a lot of flack for his recruiting or lack thereof near the end of his time in Blacksburg. How realistic was it to win more than 3 games with this roster? Where exactly was, A to Z this roster when Brent Pry arrived?
It was not good in terms of the overall talent that they had. Struggle spots, especially in the offensive side, and they just didn't have as many defensive playmakers as they normally have. And I think you see that here in this draft season coming up. I mean, Chamari Connor is probably the only guy that's going to get drafted, and he's got about a 5th round grade on him. I mean, that's just not typically what you've seen at Virginia Tech, even in lean times. So
Right.
It was just a struggle overall. The problems from the Justin Fuente era is they got some players occasionally, but they didn't retain them very well, and there just weren't a ton of them. So you get to even past that first team, and it just dropped off a cliff. It was very noticeable. Maybe you could be passable in that first group, but there were a lot of spots where they were playing people out of necessity last year, and if they didn't have anybody else that they could put in the game, there were no other options. So I think it was really a struggle. It should have won more than 3 games. I think that was, they gave away the ODU game at the end, gave away Georgia Tech, NC State. They were right there. I think this could have been a bowl team last year with just, things go a certain way in a few games, or they coach or play a little bit better down the stretch. But I predicted them at, I think, 6-6. And I said, if they get to a bowl game, that was an accomplishment. They underachieved on that by quite a lot. So I think, talent deficiency for sure, but they also struggled quite a bit.
Yeah, I remember, Andy, when we did our previews for Virginia Tech last summer, one of the things that jumped out to me, they were moving guys around the field a lot of guys, quote unquote, switching positions. And of course, the coaching staff, as all of them do, was quick to point out, no, we think he might be better suited for this position. But a lot of what I read on the Virginia Tech side from you and others was, well, it could be true. It also could be true that they just don't have the bodies, that they need to move guys around. They don't have the depth that you would need to try and put this thing together in year 1 for Brent Pry. And I think he did the best he could with it. Certainly the 87th toughest schedule. You would hope that they could do more with that if they have that situation again in 2023. But there's no doubt that it was a steep learning curve in year 1 and that he was up against it. As we look ahead now, I guess, to year 2, the offense brings back 73% of its production. This was, as you said, a really bad offense. Is that returning production stat good? Is it good to have that much back? Or what does it look like now as they try to, ratchet this thing up and use what they've got to move things ahead?
I do always love that when we talk about returning production and like, oh, they have 10 starters back or whatever it is. It's like, well, how many, that many starters on the 118th ranked offense? How good can that be?
Yeah,
right.
It's good to have some experience coming back. You don't want to just start with a completely blank slate there, but those guys need to be better. And I think, they brought in some key additions transfer wise that's going to help. Especially at the receiver spot. They lose Caleb Smith, but they bring in Ollie Jennings, Jalen Lane, DeQuan Felton, I mean, that's three options there that could be starters. I mean, they're going to mix and match, but I think those three will get a lot of playing time. Bashal Tutin, coming from North Carolina A&T, he adds to that running back room that you're not just relying on Malachi Thomas and hoping he can stay healthy all the time. I think that's a pretty good 1-2 punch if they can stay healthy in the game. And then Kyron Drones at quarterback. And, last year, I think the big issue at quarterback was they didn't trust anybody else to go into the game and make a difference. It was Grant Wells, and behind him was Jason Brown, and they never went to Jason Brown. They thought that Wells was, head and shoulders above him in pretty much all regards. And, if Wells is struggling, they don't think too highly of Jason Brown coming to the game. That can't be great for your quarterback situation. Now you have Drones, who is very green still. I mean, he hasn't played a whole lot, but he's got that 4-star pedigree, the dual threat guy. I think he runs it really well. You look at him, and he's a tremendous athlete. I think that could help in the quarterback run game, which they want to put a lot more of in the offense this year. They did a little bit of that late in the season with some success. So you add all those pieces to some of the returning guys, have a couple guys on the offensive line, even though that's a pretty young group. You can see improvement there. I mean, this isn't going to be a top 20 offense by any stretch of the imagination, but can you be a top 80 offense and get defensive improvement? I think that would be a tremendous step forward for a group that last year really just looked lost for most of the season.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that formula work elsewhere. That would not be a new concept. You mentioned the line. You mentioned it was young. One thing that strikes me in looking over the line stats, they were pretty much set from center all the way over on the right side of the line. It was basically the same three guys. And they were mostly set on the left side as well, with the exception of left guard, where they had, I guess, a little bit of rotation. But what was the deal? Was it youth? Was it scheme? Why was that line so bad?
I just don't think they were all that talented in the group. And you say they're set at center, and they had Johnny Jordan back, and he was sort of like a sixth guy the previous year, hadn't started a whole lot. Silas Janzi was the left tackle they slotted in. He was sort of like, they slid him in the guard and tried him at left tackle, right tackle, never really had a spot. And he was their left tackle, and they didn't have really anybody else to put in the game. So it's just, I didn't think the ceiling of that group was very high. And now they lose those guys, and they get really young this year. They could have redshirt freshmen at left tackle and left guard, and Xavier Chaplin and Braylon Moore. They move Cade Moore over to center. They get Parker Clements back at right tackle. He was injured in the offseason last year, had a meniscus that he was coming back from, didn't do a lot of lifting. So he didn't look quite himself for most of the year, got a little bit better at the end of the year. I think there's promise there, but it's such a young group. It's still not very deep. You get to that second team, and there's a lot of freshmen in that second team. And there are a lot of freshmen in the starting group right now. And you're talking about they're on their third offensive line coach in 3 years. And you kind of have that turnover, how much teaching are they retaining? How much are they confused by what they're hearing from a bunch of different guys? So you're just going to have to see a lot of improvement from that group, because if that doesn't improve, I don't know how much adding all those other skill players and stuff matters, because the holes aren't going to be there to run through, and they're not going to have a lot of time to throw the ball.
Do people like Brent Pry?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, that was an easy win for Pry coming off of the Justin Fuente era. Say what you will about Fuente. He was not the most personable character. That just wasn't his thing. He was a bit of an introvert, didn't like crowds, didn't like doing a lot of the head coaching things that you have to do, shaking hands and kissing babies, where, the guy before him, Frank Beamer, was the mayor of Blacksburg. That's all he did, and could go in and command a room, and everybody loves Fancy Gap Frank. And then, Fuente is sort of this dour character. And I think Pry harkens back to Frank a little bit. He's a personable guy. He's got this weird folksy manner to him, sort of like, he's from Pennsylvania. I guess he grew up most of his life in West Virginia and Virginia. So he's got this Southern twang that's tough to describe, but I don't know. He's just got like this energy about him, and he's eager to talk to people and do all the politicking stuff that you have to do as a head coach. And, I did this thing where I followed, or I got to watch them do their live recruiting show last year. And it was sort of this production they did, and they'd bring each recruit would come on with their family and stuff. And the way that Pry was chopping it up with the families and the moms and like joking with them, is like, you could just see that personality coming out there. And I think the Virginia Tech fan base sees that, and they want him to succeed. They just need to see him win more than 3 games in the season. Otherwise, I could imagine they turn on him pretty quickly.
Very healthy head of hair and facial hair, really.
I know. I'm jealous of that coif. And he's in and out with the beard all the time. I think he looks more authoritative with the beard. He probably should keep it.
It's a definite mountain man look that probably plays well in Blacksburg.
Yeah, I think somebody described, he has like this sort of leather jacket that he was wearing a bunch. And he was at like a football game. He had like the hand up and stuff. And I think somebody described it as the head coach most likely to be a country singer on College Game Day doing pick'ems that I've never heard of before. He kind of looks like that. I can see that.
When you look at the sort of current, right? You mentioned spring practice is almost over. When you look at where this team is right now, did Brent Pry, did this coaching staff do a good job? You mentioned some of the transfers coming in. Do they look the part more than they may have a year ago after Brent Pry took over? Does it seem like there are just more guys? Do they seem more battle ready? Do they seem closer to, at least eye test wise, looking like, the 2016 team? If you're going to go back to some of the better squads of recent memory, do they pass that eye test more?
They passed the eye test relative to last year.
Okay.
More. I don't know if I want to put them in the 2016 team class at all. That was a pretty veteran team.
Yeah.
That had some dudes on it. I mean, Frank didn't leave the cupboard completely bare. They had struggled there at the end of his time, and Fuente brought in Gerard Evans at quarterback, which made such a huge difference. But that was a senior-laden group that was pretty physically mature in a lot of ways. I don't know if this group is quite in that class. But you look out there and you see more athletes, I think. You see more guys that go, I could see him contributing. I can see him playing in these games. They just didn't have a ton of that last year. They had a first team that was passable. Mm-hmm. And then when he got to that second team, you're going, oh, man, this could be problematic if this guy has to play a whole lot. I think there's a little bit less of that this year. You're going to get injuries. You're going to have guys that don't live up to the billing that you think in the preseason. So you're going to need that kind of depth to get by. And I think they have more of that this year. So I think there's reasons for encouragement there.
Something that's always interesting to me, and I guess this goes back a few years, but it exists in the modern day. Virginia Tech has been very blippy at quarterback, for lack of a better term, right? They have a blip of Hendon Hooker looking like he is going to be the guy for a long time. That fizzles out his time in Blacksburg. They have the blip of the best of Michael Brewer. They have a blip of, Gerard Evans probably declaring too early. They only get a year of him. Logan Thomas is a blip of high flashing potential, but never really looks the part as like a big national power at quarterback. Why hasn't Virginia Tech, be it in the portal, be it with guys they've recruited, what is it about, I don't know if it's Blacksburg, this program, whatever, that they just haven't had a consistent star QB in what feels like forever?
I'm not sure what it is. If I knew, I think I'd be making more money than I'm making right now. But that has been a consistent problem here, because you look back at the history of Virginia Tech, and when it was great, it had great quarterback play. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about Jim Druckenmiller, Michael Vick, Brian Randall, Tyrod Taylor, Logan Thomas, that year that everybody's talking, he's going to be the top pick in the draft after 2011 with how great he was with that group. And they just haven't had that in the last decade plus. Gerard Evans had that really great year. Even he got overshadowed in the ACC. The ACC that year was absurd with Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, and Trubisky getting the first top 3 spots all ACC. But yeah, it's been a problem. And that was sort of the downfall of the Fuente era, was that he never kept and maintained and developed that quarterback. It was a new quarterback every single year. And on top of that, you let a Heisman Trophy candidate get away and flourish at Tennessee while you're struggling behind them with Braxton Burmeister and Connor Blumrick and Knox Kadum. It's just not a Power 5 group of quarterbacks there. And I think if he had handled that quarterback situation better, he might still be here, but he just didn't. And I don't know if that's specific to Virginia Tech or it's specific to the coaching or what exactly. I will say it doesn't seem like Virginia produces a ton of just top flight quarterbacks anymore.
Right.
I mean, I talk about Vic and Randall and Tyrod Taylor. These are all guys that came from the 757.
I was going to ask about that.
It's just been a drought down there. They don't produce quarterbacks like that anymore for some reason. And if they did, I would like Virginia Tech's chances of getting them, but they haven't. So, you have to go elsewhere to get your quarterbacks, and maybe that has something to do with it. But,
right.
You're right. Until they figure that out, until they get some consistent play there, or have like a difference maker at that spot, I don't know how good Virginia Tech can be.
What is the state of, I guess, for lack of a better term, the Tidewater region and recruiting? We spoke to Manny Navarro, and he talks about how there's a ton of athletes in South Florida, but the coaching isn't great. And you look at LA and how that's changed, where everybody just assumes that there's, this crazy amount of talent in Southern California. And while there is, it's changed in the last 20 years. What is the state of top flight football players in that Tidewater region that, everybody, on the East Coast, in the Southeast, recruits and covets?
Yeah, I don't think it's as good as it used to be. I think that peaked, turn of the century, a little bit afterwards there. I don't know if that's a demographics thing. I don't know if that's a coaching thing. I know there's been a lot of cycling of coaches from the high school ranks out of there. It's 7-on-7 stuff has really taken on a greater importance with a lot of these guys. I do know that Northern Virginia has been a great place for players lately. Richmond area has been pretty strong, and maybe rivaling or taking over the Tidewater in terms of top talent in the state. I'm sure that's a whole other podcast
Sure.
right there. I'm sure people get very fiery about who has the best talent in the state, but I think the big thing with Virginia Tech is they just haven't been able to seal off the borders and get those top guys. I think last year, the top recruit in state that Virginia Tech had was number 16.
Wow.
And that's not unusual. That's the weird part, is they're just not, or have not been recently in contention for those top flight guys in the state. And it used to be they get a lot of them. And I'm not saying that's the only way to build a roster, but that is a pretty easy way to build a roster, is if you keep those in-state guys at home. So, and I think Brent Pry recognizes that. Strangely, his biggest competition is Penn State, where he used to work, and James Franklin coming down and poaching all the best guys. So that's a pretty heavy lift there to try to reverse that whole thing. But, that is the task at hand, and you have to creep up and do a little bit better and maybe snag one of the top 10 or two of the top 10. And then eventually you're in the running for a lot more guys up there. And I think that's why they're really hitting the state hard and trying to reestablish relationships here. But certainly talent-wise in the Tidewater, you get back to the original question, not quite what it was 15, 20 years ago.
What is the state of internal investment in Virginia Tech football? Facilities-wise, assistant pool-wise, how much is Brent Pry getting that I'm sure he already asked for when he was hired? Is Virginia Tech lagging behind? Are they making that investment to spend more on recruiting? What is the NIL situation like? Where is this program infrastructure wise?
I think it's okay. I don't think it's a deficit. They were really struggling there for a while in assistant pay. It was pretty low relative to peers. They bumped up that pool when Pry got hired. I think it was $5.5 million, something like that, which sounded good at the time. But now you see some of these salaries out there and you're like, man, they got to bump it up again to be competitive. That's just how prices go as they go up. Facility wise, they just finished a lot of building of stuff. They redid the weight room. They have the student athletes performance center, the dining hall that they have overlooking the practice field and the indoor facility. They just built dorms. They upgraded the meeting rooms. I mean, this was stuff that was long overdue that they had, sort of let lag during the Beamer era. Because, when Beamer's winning so much, they're like, well, why do we need to spend more money if we're winning the way we're doing it? That's
if it ain't broke, right?
Right. That's sort of what happens with those longtime head coaches. I think a little bit of, complacency sets in terms of facilities and assistant pay like that. And they've addressed all that stuff. And now NIL is a whole new thing to throw into the mix. And who knows with NIL if these figures are real. I can't imagine Virginia Tech's near the top. I don't think Virginia Tech's near the bottom. I think they do okay, though. Blacksburg, not exactly bright lights, big city in terms of attracting recruits or the NIL dollars like that. But I think they do okay in this area. So it's going to be like Virginia Tech has always been. They're going to have to find ways to compete against deeper resource schools. And that's been the case forever. I mean, they were never the highest paid or the the deepest pocketed school when they were successful. They found a formula for, getting a few stars and supplementing them with developmental guys. And I think that formula can still exist. They just need to hit on a bit more stars and develop guys at a little bit better rate than they have been.
What is the aggression like with Pry and this staff in terms of not just recruiting today, but 2024, 2025, 2026? Is this a staff and recruiting department that is canvassing the state, that is sort of building relationships? Are you seeing those sophomores on campus perhaps more than you saw during the Fuente or even Beamer era? Is this a recruiting staff that is fully modernized?
Well, I think the effort is certainly there, and they're going after the in-state relationships harder than the previous staff. That was something that sort of atrophied under Justin Fuente. Was like I mentioned before, just not the most personable guy. And, he sort of dipped out of state and went to North Carolina. It was at North Carolina to Virginia Tech was a big thing early on. And then Texas to Virginia Tech became a thing, even though they never really got enough recruits that panned out from Texas to justify that. I think a lot of in-state high school coaches, I talked to a bunch of them, took offense at that and go, you're going to Texas to get a 3-star? Like, what the hell? We got guys in our backyard here. Why are you going that far to do that? So I think it burned a lot of bridges in that sense. And then, with Bud Foster retiring, you lose that thing that you can point to, that guy who's recruited the state for a long time and a name that everybody knows. So it's just a lot of hurdles to overcome for this new staff. And I think, you look at the recruiting classes they've taken so far, and it's been double-digit guys from Virginia, in the teens from Virginia. I think they're going to continue to do that. And they might not be the highest ranked guys. I think they liked a lot of the guys they have, but a lot of that is just reestablishing those relationships. They got a couple guys from Highland Springs, who's been a really strong program in Richmond here. Head coach is Lauren Johnson, who used to play here. And, Fuente didn't do a lot of work with guys coming from Highland Springs there. That seems like a natural connection that you need to make. So that's the kind of thing that they're doing. And I think they're making a point to be in every Virginia high school every single year, even if there aren't, top flight prospects every year, because there will be one in 3 years or something like that. Sure. And I think coaches notice that. And I think that gets back to the relationships thing. And that's why I think this is going to be a slow burn type thing and a slow improvement, because I don't think that happens overnight. I don't think you just show up and are like, all right, give me all your best recruits again because we're here. So I think they're doing the right things on that front.
Andy, we're recording this on Monday, April 10th. The Virginia Tech spring game is the 15th, if memory serves. So it's coming up. Obviously a lot to work on. Where are you going to focus your attention when you see, whatever version of a game is out there? What is the first thing that your eye will be trained on as we project forward now into 23?
Quarterbacks. I'm like all the fans. I'm going to watch all the quarterbacks and chart every single throw and probably read in too much into every single thing that they do. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is such an important part of this offense. And people are curious to see what Kyron Drones brings to the table. And Grant Wells did not play great last year. And I think there's a segment of the fan base that's like anybody but him.
Right.
Well, you got to have somebody that's capable that can go out there if you're going to replace the guy who's, despite struggles last year, has started 3 years in college and still knows the system from last year and, could do better if you give him a bit more pieces around him to throw to. These spring games, they never really run the ball a ton. I don't think any coach goes out there and let's go run it down their throats. They don't want anybody to get hurt. So you see a lot of passing. And that's where I'm curious to see how these quarterbacks do. See how they run the offense, how comfortable they look throwing to these receivers, and to see how these receivers match up against these defensive backs. Because I look at the cornerbacks on this team with Dorian Strong and Mansour Delane and Derek Canteen, who they brought in as a transfer. And I think that's a really good trio of cornerbacks. And if these receivers can get separation or make plays on these cornerbacks, I think they can do it against anybody that they play up against, because I think it's such a solid group on defense. So, didn't see a lot of separation last year from receivers in general. I would like to see that in the spring game if I'm a Hokies fan, to feel encouraged about this offense at all.
What are reasonable expectations for 2023? Other than saying, well, they got to win more than 3 games, what would indicate real progress to you? Because if I mentioned the schedule from last year. I think the schedule this year looks a little bit tougher, but it's not astronomically harder. You would seem to think that any kind of better organized front from Virginia Tech in 23 would yield better results. What does progress look like for you?
Well, I say get to a bowl game. And that, that's a 3-win improvement from last year. And last year looks a little strange. That UVA game got canceled at the end of the year. I think they could have won that one. That would have been a 4th win. But I mentioned the games they gave away last year at the end, or very easily could have won by just making a play or two, or a better decision or two. They've got to make some of those this year. They've got to be better on offense. And I think you do that, and 6 wins for sure is within reach. And it's amazing that we're talking about Virginia Tech, a school that had a 30-whatever-year bowl streak or whatever it was. And we're like, if they get to a bowl game, that's an accomplishment. But that's where the program is right now. And I just don't think you go from 3-8 to 9-3 or something like that. That's too much of a leap in my mind for them to make. So I split the difference. I go, if you can get to 6 wins, 7 wins, I think that'd be a very encouraging step in the right direction, and sign that this program is at least getting back in the direction of what it used to be.
The schedule's pretty good, by the way.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
The home road splits aren't bad. There's no crazy run of super tough opponents. I believe they miss both Clemson and North Carolina. They have a bunch of new quarterbacks, new coaches, so it's not unreasonable. Am I wrong here to say that, you said reasonable expectation is a bowl game, but you look at this, this should be, if the roster has been upgraded, a 6-7 win team.
It's a weird schedule
yes.
for Virginia Tech fans, because they dropped the divisions this year.
Right.
And they play almost nobody from the old Coastal. They still have Virginia on there, but they open up ACC play. I think it's Pitt, Florida State, and Wake Forest. I can't remember the exact order of those teams, and that's a pretty tough opening. Pitt always gives them trouble. Florida State coming off the year they had last year, and Wake Forest has been a really solid program that I think they get them in Lane Stadium this year, so maybe a little bit of help there. But when they've gone down to Winston-Salem, they've struggled in that game. Non-conference, they don't have an FCS game, so it's not have that automatic win there. They should beat ODU, but they should have beaten ODU last year, I thought, too, and they ended up losing to them. Purdue and Rutgers, Purdue changed there. Obviously they won the Big Ten West last year, but I don't think that's the same team. Losing their coach and their quarterback and whatever else they did. Marshall could be a sneaky tough game on the road at Marshall there too. I think it boils down to is there's not too many teams that you go, Virginia Tech should beat that team.
Right.
That's just not where this team is right now. And when you throw enough coin flips in there, it's going to come down to those little things that you do in the game, whether they can come out on top. So they don't play Clemson. They don't play North Carolina. That is helpful. But there's a lot of games in there that they're about the same as, ideally, if you're thinking of positively from a Virginia Tech fan's perspective, that could be a 50-50 type toss-up.
Well, and, you mentioned the 30-year streak. There was an acknowledgement, though, coming into this era of Hokies football with Brent Pry, that they were going to have to hit the reboot button, that this was going to be starting over, and that it might take a little bit, if only because the roster wasn't there. And they had some real issues with depth. So hopefully they can get back there. As we look, though, back at 2022, maybe one final time here before we start to wrap, what is the grade for Brent Pry? Given all of the challenges that were in place in Blacksburg, how did he do A through F?
I'd say maybe a C-, somewhere there. It's always tough.
Yeah.
You're a lot of these coaches are only as good as the talent around them. And there's only so much you can do in that first year with the roster, short of just going to the transfer portal and adding 15 guys or whatever. But, this is coming off the extra COVID year initially. They had to trim a bunch of guys just to get to the 85 number because he no longer had that relief from the NCAA. So I don't really think they were in really addition mode last year when they went into the season. And, I don't know if it was just that restriction or naivete about what they had on the roster coming back, but it was just going to be a struggle. I think anybody would have struggled. I think even if Fuente was here and he knew that roster and he constructed that roster for the most part, I don't think he was going to have very much success with last year's team either. So I give it a C- because I think they could have coached better and done little things to do better than 3 wins. And maybe I'm being a bit forgiving of a grader here, but I just
Right.
I just went into the season with expectations, and I had them in that 5 to 6 win range, and they didn't quite get there. So I come in a little bit lower than that, a little bit lower than average, but not quite the outright failure I think a lot of people would give them from the outside.
I like that you use the word forgiving, because I'm curious, how forgiving is this fan base? How patient is this fan base? How much wiggle room does Brent Pry and this staff have with fans, with administrators, with the donor class? This is obviously a smart, savvy fan base that has gotten used to at least a bar of success. Is there if Virginia Tech is down again this year, if they're not really threatening a bowl once again, are we looking at a half-empty Lane Stadium, or is this a fan base locked in and knows that they're going to see through some cold, dark times and that there's light at the end of the tunnel?
It's tough to say. I mean, any fan base can say they're going to be patient with a rebuild, and then you lose 7 straight games, and it's like, well, what? You're doing something that hasn't been done here since like 1950?
Right.
Like, what are we watching here? So I think the honeymoon period is over at this point. People will still talk themselves positively about this team until the season comes around. But when September gets here, you better win some games, because, yeah, you can say this was a rebuilding project. They have to redo it. But missing bowl games is not something that Virginia Tech fans are used to.
No.
It's something they don't accept. I mean, when the team a couple of years ago decided not to go to a game during the COVID season, because it was just the weight of that entire season, everything they had to go to, they didn't want to really extend it at all. There was a big group of the fan base and alumni. They're like, what the heck, man? You had a chance to play in a bowl game. You chose not to. And then last year, they didn't even get the choice. They just weren't even close to accepting it. So if you're not making a bowl game, at least, that is seen as an outright failure by this fan base. And I suppose they'll give him the mulligan for year one, but there's only so long you can go on losing that many games before even the most optimistic or forgiving fan bases will turn on you, even if they like Pry. And I think they like Pry. But you got to win some games or it's going to get ugly pretty quick.
Andy, let's close out with this. It's a Dan question. I'm going to steal it from him. He'll often ask our team guests, give me the name of a player that is giving fans the tingles right now, giving fans the vapors. Maybe a transfer that's come in that could potentially impact things. Maybe a recruit, maybe a guy who's been on the roster the whole time. But who is that one guy, the high upside guy that has Hokies fans all excited?
High upside guy. So it can't be somebody that like broke out last year a little bit. Otherwise, I'd say Mansour Delane, because everybody loves Mansour Delane, even though he only started like 4 games or whatever it is at the end of last year. I think offensively, I'd probably say Kyron Drones, even though there's so much unknown with him at quarterback. And I think just the possibility of him taking over and a brand new quarterback and dual threat guy, that's been when Virginia Tech's at its best, it's had that dual threat guy under center. I think the possibilities there get people pretty excited about a change at quarterback. And I think defensively, I'll throw Kelly Lawson's name out there. I don't know if it's as much as the offensive side, just because naturally you're not going to get as much buzz on that side. But he played a little bit last year, and he used to be a receiver. He's like 6'6". I think they list him at 6'4", but he's really like 6'6". He's a beanpole, but he's added a little bit of bulk to him. He's just length and athleticism and just limbs all over the place. And, he tipped the ball into the air against Georgia Tech and picked it off, returned it for a touchdown. I just think if he keeps developing, he could be something special on that defensive side. I don't know if he gets all the fans tinkly about that, but as a writer and a reporter watching this team, I'm going, man, that guy could be a dude if he keeps progressing the way that he has.
All right. His name is Andy Bitter, senior staff writer, lead football beat writer for Tech Sideline. Andy, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that we need to promote while you're here? You do such good work.
Just go subscribe to TSL. That's where all my stuff is. We do podcasts, analysis, reporting. It's one-stop shop for Virginia Tech. It's the only place you're going to get that.
Love it.
Awesome. Andy, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.